We've got power over nature, right? We can destroy it if we want to. Well, today we're going to look at the Prelude by William Wordsworth. It's actually only an extract. It's part of a much larger poem, really long. Such long poems are called epics. Now, we can't really study the entire epic poem for the GCSE, so we just need to look at an extract. As always, with our poems, we need to know the context, story, language structure, and the reason why the poet wrote it. So let's begin and take a look at the context of the poem. William Wordsworth, like Percy Shelley and William Blake, was writing around this time again. We're seeing the rise of industrialisation. We're seeing factories spring up, trains travelling faster than anything anybody had ever seen before, industry spreading across the countryside, levelling trees and forests, digging into the ground. It really did seem like we had control over nature, and we were profiting from it. We were becoming richer and more powerful. As industrialisation spread, there was the belief that we could ultimately control nature, and nature could not control us. Today we have a bit of a problem with that idea because we know about global warming and we understand that our actions affect the planet, but back in the 1800s they didn't really know that. They thought they could control nature. Now obviously there are examples where nature has control over us: thunderstorms, hurricanes, tsunamis, etc. And this could have made for quite an obvious poem. What William Wordsworth did instead was he took something a little more unnerving, but therefore a bit more powerful. Very simply, he wanted to show that nature had power over us, but not in the obvious way, the physical way, but in a much more emotional, possibly spiritual way. And because it's an emotional or spiritual way, there's no possible way that man could have power over this spiritual or emotional power of nature. There's no way man could chop it up and burn it or turn it into coal. He believed that it didn't matter how much we destroyed the physical nature around us by digging into the ground or destroying trees. Ultimately we would never control nature because it had a much deeper power over us than we could understand. And this context leads quite neatly into the story of the poem. The extract that we're given is pretty short. The story is fairly simple. A man goes out on a boat on a moonlit night, and as he gets closer towards a mountain, something makes him scared, something freaks him out. The huge size of the mountain, perhaps. Unnerved, he goes back home, only to be plagued by the memory of that looming mountain. That sense of nature's power hung with him for 3 or 4 days afterwards. And even, as he says in the poem, it troubled his dreams. Let's take a look at the language. To begin, the poet goes out and finds a little boat tied to a willow tree, which he then takes out for a ride. This is a metaphor for our connection with nature. The little boat is us, and the willow tree is nature, and we're tied together. But the poet takes the little boat, takes us out away from nature, out on our own. The poet uses the adjective troubled here. There's something, it's not pleasurable, there's something troubling about what he's doing. It's slightly unnerving. Perhaps there's something to be scared of here. In fact, we get this sense that there's something perhaps to be scared of because the poet goes out in stealth, which means hidden. What is he hiding from? Ultimately, perhaps the power of nature. Then the poet sees, he fixes his view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the top of a mountain perhaps of some sort, quite far away. He sets up the image for us so that we can see it. Nothing but the stars and the grey sky. This very simple image highlights the focus of the craggy ridge this unnerving thing that's appearing on the horizon and makes it stand out. We can see that there's some sort of focus on this ridge. Nevertheless, the poet at this point doesn't seem to be too concerned. His boat is going through the water quite calmly. That's what's suggested by this simile. A swan is something very graceful, so nothing worrying the poet at this point. Everything seems fine. But then suddenly, where it says voluntary power instinct, this craggy step suddenly upreared its head. It's as if this mountain in some way suddenly, with a voluntary power, that means with a will of its own, as if nature is alive in some way, suddenly sticks its head up. The adjective grim suggests something scary. The poet is definitely scared by what he's seeing. The power of nature is something scary here, because to him it seemed as if the power of nature had its own decision-making abilities, as if nature really were alive, really were a person. So the poet, again, still trying to hide himself from the power of nature, silently made his way back to the willow tree. The power of nature had certainly scared him immensely here, and this memory stayed with him for many days. He didn't just remember it for 1 or 2 days, but for many days. Such was the impact of this experience the poet had whilst out on his boat. In fact, he uses the noun. He uses a noun here, darkness. There hung a darkness, which again suggests something dangerous, perhaps something untrustworthy. He even says perhaps solitude or blank desertion, in some way that he now felt completely alone. Now that he'd seen the possibly evil side of nature, now whenever he looked at nature there wasn't anything familiar. There was no familiar shapes, no pleasant images of trees, but instead nature is some huge and mighty form. Two important adjectives there expressing the power behind nature, something that man could never ultimately defeat, and this undefeatable power troubles his dreams. What about structure? The poem does not rhyme, but there is some sort of structure there. Each line is 10 syllables long, and this gives it a sense of flow, some sense of rhythm. But of course it's not obvious. When you look at the poem, it does look like the poem doesn't have any rules at all. Look how each line is a different length to the last. There's no consistent punctuation at the end of each line, so it looks like there is no structure. But when you look very carefully, there is a set of rules hidden underneath. Perhaps this suggests that nature, the power of nature, has a hidden set of rules underneath that we don't know about. And perhaps those hidden rules, hidden within the power of nature, is where this will of its own came from. Perhaps nature really does have a set of rules. It's not as chaotic as you think. It does make sensible, logical decisions, but they're unknowable to man, perhaps. Also, you will have noticed this is a poem in the first person. Lots of use of the pronoun I throughout. Why do poets write things in the first person perspective? Very simply, because it is more personal, and as a result you get something more emotional response to a particular issue, and people are more likely to believe it to be honest as well. So there's 2 points about structure there. It's strange, chaotic, but ordered overall structure, and that it's in the first person. So let's see where we've got to so far. We have considered the context of the poem, the story of the poem, the language used, and we've covered the structure. It really just leaves us to try and understand what the intention behind the poem is. What is the writer trying to achieve? What is the effect the writer wants to have on his reader here? Well, he wants to remind the reader that nature is not only extremely powerful, nature is something to be fearful of, and nature is also something that thinks like we do, but in a way unlike us. And combined with this power behind nature, nature is ultimately something very dangerous and probably something we should respect. You could probably see that this particular poem links with all sorts of other poems from the collection. So this poem would compare really well with any of the other poems that cover nature and the power of nature. So we can think of the poem Exposure, the one set in the trenches with the extreme cold that's threatening to kill the soldier. We could also think of Storm on the Island, another one where man is being threatened by nature, in this case a storm. So thanks for watching, keep up the revision, good luck.